our last speaker, Ricardo. I feel very honored that he accepted to speak with us this morning. I'm going to read quickly for the audience your bio so they know who you are. It's very impressive, and I'm very happy for the topic you're going to discuss, which is the frameworks around AI. Ricardo Vallates is part-time professor at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm and is a part-time professor of the Engineering of University Fabra in Barcelona and Computer Science University of Chile in Santiago. Before, he was the director of research at the Institute for Experiential AI of Northeastern University in Silicon Valley from 2021 to 2025 and the VP of research at Yahoo Labs. He's the co-author of the best-selling book, Modern Information Retrieval textbook by the Addison Wesley, 2099 and 2011, and he won this 2000 Book of the Year award. In 2009, he was named the ACM Fellow. He has won national scientific awards in Chile, Spain, among other distinctions. He obtained a PhD in computer science from the University of Waterloo, Canada. His area of expertise are responsible AI, web search, and data mining, plus data science and algorithms.
Okay, perfect. Only detail was Northeastern, not Northwestern. That's a typical people who don't know why Northwestern instead of Northeastern. So let me share my presentation. I will mainly talk about principles and AI governance. Perfect. So first I would like to discuss why I use responsible AI and not other terms. A lot of people use AI. The problem with AI is that AI is not human. So it cannot be ethical, also cannot be just, have equity, can be trusted in some sense. These are human traits, and I prefer not to associate human traits to a machine or to a software. Other people use trustworthy AI, but the problem is that we know that doesn't work all the time. So why we're putting the burden on the user to basically saying that needs to be trusted. So that's why people prefer responsible AI, but that puts the burden on the creator. Some people doesn't want to have this burden, and then they use things like AI safety or AI ethics that basically they're more neutral and don't put the problem on the creator. But I believe the creators need to be responsible and accountable. These are my main problems today. I don't care much about future issues. I think we have enough problems today that we need to solve before doing anything else. For example, we have automated discrimination, we have pseudoscience, we have unfair e-commerce. Almost all digital markets like Amazon, AliExpress, etc. are unfair. Then you have the environmental impact. A lot of resources are being wasted. And all these things are human incompetence. Sometimes human incompetence comes in the pure way. I will not be able to give examples of all these things. I will give only some to go into the details of regulation and other topics on governance. But with generative AI, we have more disinformation. We have copyright issues. For example, New York Times and Daily News case against OpenAI and Microsoft. And finally, we have mental health issue, which is something that it really worries on. Now, there was an engineer in Silicon Valley that started this curated database of incidents before the pandemic. And until 2020, it looked like it was increasing linearly, maybe 2 per week. However, when OECD started to use AI to monitor AI news, this thing changed at the end of 2020, and you know why. This thing started to grow very fast, and now we are talking about 700, maybe 800 problems per year. So that means not 2 per week, but 3 per day. Now, let me give you just 2 examples, maybe the worst examples I know about bad use of systems, not necessarily AI, but with some AI. So the first one was a system to look for fraud in childcare benefits. This was in the Netherlands. And this system wrongly accused 26,000 families of cheating. They were people, because that's why they were asking for the benefit. 42% were immigrants, so it seemed that they were targeted. And after 5 years of this problem, 4 NGOs sued the government. This became public, and one Secretary of State resigned. And then in 2020, finally, the court says that this was unlawful and the people should be compensated. Luckily, the government didn't go to the appeals level and then the Supreme level. That would have taken much time because the problem was already affecting 100,000 people. And then the opposition, after some reports from the Dutch parliament, requested accountability. And January 14 of 2021, the leader of the opposition resigned. Yes, I was the Minister of Social Affairs during the previous large crisis that faced our country. The tax authority started an unjust hand of thousands of families. He resigned, although he was not now in the government. Well, the next day, the whole government resigned. This was Mark Rutte, that today has a very high position in the European Union. But let me give you another example that I learned later. that I thought this cannot be worse. Yes, this is worse, at least in the number of people. So again, looking for fraud in poor people if they had received too much welfare. This is already an ethical issue, because if you want to look for fraud, you should start by rich people, not by poor people. Poor people need generally welfare. After 5 years of a system that accused a lot of people of receiving more money, almost 500,000 people, did a class action against the Australian government, and in 2020 they won it, and now even the compensation is higher, and they're spending more than $1 billion in compensation. Of course, the main goal of the system was to reduce the cost of work. At the end, this was more. So what we can do to avoid these problems, that are plenty. Now there are more than 10,000 in the OECD database, more than 1,000 curated in the incident database of the AI, and so on. So we can see that the main applied ethics comes from bioethics, from the Belmont report in 1979. And basically there's 4 basic values there: autonomy, do good, don't do bad, and justice. I'm putting here do good and don't do bad. Basically one is the opposite of the other. And here are possible 3 applications, like informed consent for autonomy, basically respecting the human dignity, a risk and benefits assessment in the case of beneficial and no harm, and for example, the right subject selection in a sample, for example, related to justice. And here at the right, we have possible software characteristics that are tied to these principles, these values: autonomy, for example, consent, transparency, agency, and so on, and benefit, things like scientific basis, competency, safety, accuracy, and justice, for example, accountability, possibility of redress. But these principles may conflict, and there is when we have a real ethical issue. For example, I need to restrict your autonomy so you don't harm yourself, or maybe you harm others. And this is based in a work of Janja, and then we improve it to include the ACM principles here. So some governance questions that we need to answer. For example, to whom is important what you're doing? To which part of the system applies? Are all equally important? Are they orthogonal? Can they be fulfilled? For example, in Northern European culture, you don't ask for transparency because you believe in accountability. But in Southern Europe, you really want transparency because you don't believe in accountability from the institutions. But now we're asking both things together. Do they make sense? Probably not. And, for example, is really a principle or just a method to achieve a principle? So in the case of regulation, the first regulation that we had is the regulation in China, 2023 for AI. And it's a very tough regulation, and all Chinese models have to pass this regulation. So this started like 1 year before the European regulation. Many people say there's no regulation in China. That's not true. Now, the EU AI Act took a long time to be passed, more than 3 years. Most of it will be valid next year because they had a 2-year delay to enact most of it. Now, there are several problems here. Should we regulate the use of technology? We have never done it. This should be, good regulation is independent of technology. Imagine human rights based on technology. You will need to have a huge list of things for all possible ways to break human rights with different technologies. I prefer to have this regulation. Another problem, non-AI loophole. We don't need AI to harm people. The RoboDev case of Australia is a case that was almost no AI. We need to apply this regulation to any automated system, not only to AI. Otherwise, people will say, I don't use AI and don't have to fulfill the regulation. And the last problem is that we're creating categories that don't exist. For example, high and low risk systems. So where is the boundary between high and low or marginal? Because by default, there are some cases that don't have any risk. And the problem that risk is a continuous variable, so we don't know these boundaries. These are fictitious boundaries. We already have done this in the past. For example, where is the boundary between dark skin and light skin? That doesn't exist. There are categories that were created for power. Moreover, we don't know how to measure risk. For example, how many people may die? What is the probability of a possible incident? And so on. We know very little technically how to. In 2022, I was one of the lead authors with Gina Matthews of the new ACM principles for responsible systems. These are instrumental principles. These are not ethical values. These are instrumental principles to basically do AI governance. And the new ones are the ones that are in yellow. Here you have the 2017 version, and there you have the 22 version. And let me explain them with my governance in time. So you have an idea. The first principle is legitimacy and competence, a principle that I push in this statement. And there, what do you do? A risk impact assessment. Basically, you need to show that the system is beneficial for society and the harms are controlled. You need to show that you have all the competencies to do it. For example, you have the administrative competence, so if someone is requesting that you do this or that you have the permission to do it, and then you need to have the technical competency and also the domain competency of the application, for example, medicine, law, and so on. Then we have the 5 main principles to design and operate the system and deploy the system. You need to think about minimizing harm. You need to be transparent. You need to have security and privacy. You need to have it understand how the system works, and you need explanation for a specific output, why the system decided that. And because sometimes when people read minimize harm, they only think about people, we put limiting environmental impacts explicitly. It's not only about people, it's about the planet. We need to keep the planet safe. And then you need to do validation and testing. You need to have monitoring tools. And then you may use some boxes to keep this maintained to achieve the goals of the system. And when it fails, you need to have contestability and auditability, and then you will have an algorithmic audit. And then when it harms people, it's too late. You cannot do anything. You will be accountable and responsible, and maybe you need to go to court. Now, there are places where you need to be very careful. For example, never do an audit to a legitimate system. For example, a system that shouldn't exist shouldn't be audited. Why? Because then you legitimize the system. Also here is very important red teaming. For example, in the risk impact assessment, in the validation and testing, all stakeholders contest all your hypotheses to make sure that you are taking into account all the possible points of view. This will never be perfect. There are things that we will not know until they happen, but at least to cover the possible cases that people come with. In 2023, because we did this just before GPT-3, we had to extend this to generative AI, guidance on deployment and use, ownership, problem we did before. What do you do with copyright? What do you do with ownership? Personal data control, a lot about privacy, and then correctability. Can you fix the system so something wrong doesn't happen again? Also, we need to stress transparency, auditability, limited impacts, and more security and privacy, and we kept the other 5. At the end, the full number of principles, instrumental principles, is 13. And then we have the same for the governance, and here, basically limits and guidance on the end use. You need to think about it beginning, and ownership too, for example, when you get the data, and then personal data control will be on the middle, and stability will be together with stability. And again, as I said, a lot of red teaming that will be needed. Let me give you a real ethical dilemma. Maybe some of you know the famous trolley problem. The problem with the trolley problem is that this problem will never exist. It's a theoretical problem for philosophers. So let's say these are all the people killed by cars today. What happens with self-driving cars? You don't need to convince me that they will kill less people. They don't drink, they don't look at their mobile phone, they don't sleep, and so on. However, the problem is that self-driving car will kill some people that before were not in danger of being killed. And maybe we will save a lot of irresponsible people, mainly men, that were driving without the right mind. And we will kill, for example, a woman, like the woman in Arizona that crossed a bicycle in 2018, and the car didn't detect her, or a kid that runs to a ball and looks like a ball and the system doesn't recognize it as a kid, or an old person that doesn't cross very fast the road. So this is the dilemma. Should we save irresponsible people and at the same time kill vulnerable people? I don't have the answer. This is something society needs to decide, but it's not trivial. Let me give you a similar example. This is what Voltaire said in 1748, and we all agree with this. Better to have a guilty man free than put an innocent one in prison. This is an average, because if the guilty man is Jack the Ripper, maybe we don't want him to be free. But depends on the context, but in general, this is true. The Blackstone rule said it's not 1, it's 10 people. Doctors, for example, have told me that they prefer to see 10 more people that are not ill, to basically don't miss a person that is ill, for example, in cancer. 20 years later, Franklin, one of the fathers of the US independence, said it's not 10, it's 100. And if you read the quote, you cannot argue with him. He's right. Of course, all these are contextual, but even on average, these famous people, good thinkers, don't have a single answer. One said 1, 10, or 100. And let me give you a bad example for accountability. This case of the Uber surviving car that killed a woman in Arizona. Who is responsible? The company that puts the product in the market is responsible. That's it for any product. So these is the same. So a language model, the company that puts the language model in the market. So what was responsible in the case of, in less than a week, Uber got an agreement with the family of the victim, and the family didn't sue them. Nobody knows how much money they paid. And at the same time, they informed the state of Arizona that the woman inside the car, because it was a backup driver that also was a woman, was watching a video. So she was not putting attention, and only 2 seconds before the crash, she received the warning. And of course, in 2 seconds, if you are distracted, you cannot do anything. So instead, accused this person of the death, basically manslaughter, and only 4 years later, she finally gave an interview because she was a vulnerable person. She was a Mexican immigrant, transgender. Minimal salary was the only word that she could get because she was discriminated, and at the end, she was the only guilty one in this case. The responsibility is hers, but not only hers. I'm not concerned about AI. I think the problem is us, how we're using AI. I'm concerned with real intelligence. And then, although we shouldn't humanize technology, and I have another presentation where I talk about the problems of humanizing technology, because generative AI doesn't see, read, write, talk, because for doing all these things, you need to understand what you're saying or what you're generating. So you have only process text and generate text, and these predictions may be wrong, but it doesn't understand the predictions. So I will humanize a robot just to provoke you. And the question is, can we have a better future if we use AI in the right way? And if you're interested, I wrote a paper to 2023 that is open on these ideas and more problems in responsible AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Very insightful. And I love your takeaway that you're not concerned about the increase of artificial intelligence, but us as human beings using our intelligence to shape these models and the future. So thank you so much. I see a point that someone says, great point about not auditing what shouldn't exist. Those governance principles were very good. And I think they need to be more spread out. Thank you, Ricardo, for showing us your work and thought process about AI and how to build a more responsible AI. I appreciate everyone staying with us. As we saw today, responsible AI depends on all of us. Our voice matters, our question matters. Please follow Ricardo and all our speakers who are trying to move this more responsible AI future. And let's take all a part of it. And I will leave you with a phrase: don't ask what the world needs, because what the world needs is people that has come alive. So whatever makes you alive, go do it, go do good things. And the most important thing, let's keep humanity at the center of everything we do. So thank you very much for everyone.